right, so it is my great pleasure now to welcome up a good friend of mine who we're going to have a conversation. Marc Dunkleman is the author of a fantastic book, a buzzy book, an important book called, let me make sure I'm going to get it right, exactly, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back. So Marc is a fellow at Brown University's Institute for International Public Affairs. He's a former fellow at NYU's Marion Institute of Urban Management. He's worked for Democratic members in both the Senate and the House, and his thoughts and opinions have been widely published. In addition to this great book, he is author of another book called The Vanishing Neighbor, which is also a great read. And I'm excited to have a conversation with Marc about how we make government work better. Let me move over here. Hi.
Hello.
Great to have you here. Thanks for being here.
This is the kind of forum that is the highlight of this book tour, is talking to these folks. This book was written for all of you.
I love that.
Yeah.
And it really is a great book. It's for folks who haven't read it, and this is probably where I'll start my conversation, my questions for you. It's a really, really interesting and informative look at the progressive movement, small p, over the course of the last century, and how two competing instincts within the progressive movement, one about centralizing government to solve problems and one about having a more diffuse way to solve problems, are often in conflict with each other, and how that has really impacted the way that we can actually govern. So maybe I'll start with you just talking a little bit more about that, and with a couple examples maybe to show the different impulses, and where you think we are right now on the spectrum of that balance.
Sure. So the thesis of the book is that if any of us went to see a person sitting in a coffee shop in one of our districts and they were a Democratic voter, and we asked them what their top two priorities were before the last election, and someone said something to us like climate change and reproductive rights, no one would have thought twice about that. Like, that would seem very ordinary. But when you say those two things, the things that we all think about immediately afterwards about what we want to have happen in the striving for both to combat climate change and to protect reproductive rights. In the first case, in climate change, we want to push power into some bureaucracy or institution that will stop emitters from polluting the environment, right? We want to stop climate change by pushing power up into someone who is powerful enough to tell the people that are throwing carbon into the atmosphere to stop. That's a Hamiltonian impulse. We want to build something that will solve a tragedy of the common. Move to reproductive rights, that's not the narrative at all. The story in our heads, to use Walter Lippmann's now century-old term, the story in our heads is that there is a bureaucrat somewhere that is trying to tell women what to do with their bodies, and we want to take that power that is invested in an institution and push it down to the individual. Those are two different, like set aside the merits of either issue, they're two different ways of thinking about what it means to be a progressive or to be a reformer. One is pushing power up in a Hamiltonian sense, building institutions. The other is explicitly Jeffersonian. Jeffersonian is Jefferson is now a controversial figure for personal reasons, but like in the ideal sense, Jefferson wanted to empower, lay farmers, property owners. Like it was a subset of the people that we believe should be empowered, but he was afraid of centralized power. Hamilton wanted to create it. So these are two different instincts. And from the beginning of the progressive movement, which was not, like now progressives are seen, like that word has been sort of taken by the far left. Like the progressive movement was like a bunch of Republicans at the beginning, right? TR was the first progressive candidate for president, Theodore Roosevelt. And so like the sort of notion of progressivism in the way that I think we're using it here is a pretty broad spectrum of people, from the very far left to moderate Republicans. Like Nelson Rockefeller, who the former governor of New York would be considered a progressive today, or George Romney, the governor of Michigan. But across the spectrum, these two impulses have been part of our ideology from the very beginning. So that even like in the early 20th century, they were people who saw the world as it was changing under the Industrial Revolution and thought to themselves, I miss the sort of the patterns of the 19th century, of sort of small town life, of island communities and whatnot. And they wanted to take these big corporations which were disrupting everything and break them up, antitrust. That was a Jeffersonian impulse. Let's cut up the big institutions so that we can return And so like trust busting, that was a Jeffersonian impulse within the progressive movement. Others said to themselves, no, the problem is not that we don't have enough small businesses. The problem is that government hasn't kept up with the challenge of the big businesses that have emerged because of industrialization. You're not going to break up the railroads. It doesn't make any sense. You're not going to break up the steel. It's too much efficiency. What we need are big government institutions that are going to regulate these big institutions. So you get the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, a bunch of so within progressivism, and this is this is not exactly on point of what folks in this room need to know. I just want this is something that has been glossed over, I think, too often among progressives. We are ourselves in our heads and our hearts divided in thinking about here's a problem. In this case, do we want to push power up into some institution that's going to fix it? Or are we afraid that pushing power up will empower some institution that we don't trust? And throughout progressive history, like, if you go back to your high school textbook and they ask you what were the early progressives for, it'll go through a whole litany. Women's suffrage, income tax, you will also say blue ribbon commissions, so that is empowering powerful figures to make decisions on behalf of the community as a whole, and public referenda, which is the exact opposite, right? It's letting ordinary people vote on things directly, bypassing legislature. We have always had these two impulses, sometimes to push power up, sometimes to push power down, and we continue. Everyone in this room, I suspect, has these two impulses, and we've just never talked about them as being competing impulses that you need to balance. So as a framework for thinking about, I'm a mayor, I'm a county commissioner, I'm a member of a legislative body, whatever it is, these are two different ideas, and you don't have to believe that one is entirely correct and one is entirely wrong. What you need to realize is that we are all sort of inured to both. We both harbor these instincts, and we need to think thoroughly about to what degree we want to push in one direction or the other, how we balance the two as we're trying to solve problems of all sorts.
So you've talked in the book about some of the legacy challenges that both impulses leave us as progressives, small p, who are trying to solve problems. So one of the areas you talk a lot about is this idea of giving people a voice versus a veto. And I think that's something that all of the leaders in the room will have familiarity with, of this idea. You have a great story in the book about New York building and the fact that one single legislator could stop the whole thing. How do you think about how we make sure that communities and people have a voice in the process, which we all think is a good idea, but not let a single person stop progress?
Here, I think the history is super important. So I mentioned at the sort of the turn of the 20th century that progressives were caught between these two impulses, to push power up or to push power down. The guys that wanted to push power up largely won. Like Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1912 as sort of like, I'm a Jeffersonian, I'm a Southerner, I'm going to push power down. But then he creates the Federal Reserve and the Federal Trade Commission, and you get some big centralized power in the Wilson administration. And really from that moment through the 1960s, progressivism maintains both impulses, but we, as a movement, and this is going to sound strange to a lot of people in this room, we created the establishment. We had the idea that in New York, it didn't make sense to have the folks on the New Jersey side of the Hudson and the New York side of the Hudson competing on docking fees in the harbor. So we created a port authority, which would regularize those things. The Port Authority, a big, powerful institution. We created the Triborough-Britain Tunnel Authority. We created all sorts of institutions throughout America. Every town had sort of a blue ribbon commission. There's this old phrase that we all know, you can't fight City Hall. A lot of people will hear that. That never meant that you couldn't unseat an incumbent mayor. That was happening all the time. The notion was that there was some powerful cabal of people behind the mayor that whoever was sitting in that seat would have to heed. So if City Hall, those establishment figures, wanted to build a housing development on the west side of town, they wanted to build a bridge across the river here, whatever they wanted to do, there's nothing you could do about it. From the turn of the 20th century through the 1960s, progressivism is seeing tragedy to the common, saying, I'm going to push power into a big institution that's going to solve it. It's sort of the quintessential example is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was in the early 30s, just like the upper South in America was living in the 19th century in ways the rest of the country was living in the 20th. There was no electric power. The local utilities had no profit incentive to run wires to these poor farmers who are living, really sort of miserable lives. No electricity, no appliances, no nothing. And with the utilities, with the private market basically having failed, the Roosevelt administration creates this incredibly powerful Tennessee Valley Authority, empowers a lawyer from Wisconsin named David Lilienthal to basically just be like a czar of a region that's the size of England. And he does these things. He condemns land, he builds dams, he builds power plants, he connects these poor farmers up, he builds the wires from the grid to the farms, like he sells appliances to the farm, it's just enormous centralized power. And one of the most interesting discoveries I made in the course of the research for the book is I found this 4-part series in The Nation magazine, lauding Lilienthal as just the sort of this benevolent dictator. The Nation magazine, like the Nation that we all don't read still, and so that was the progressive dream. It was a Hamiltonian dream, and the same thing happened in other parts of the New Deal, the Social Security Administration, and after the New Deal with these sort of big bureaucracies, the Highway Administration, urban renewal, all sorts of policies, and then we get to the '60s and progressives, and I think I can say this, they're like, holy shit. What did we create? This Frankenstein monster of the establishment is now doing things that we hate, right? It's this imperious Pentagon that has sent us into Southeast Asia. It's the local housing authorities are knocking down whole neighborhoods, often minority neighborhoods, certainly poor neighborhoods, to make room for high rises for people. We are knocking down whole neighborhoods to build highways, right? And the people that are doing these bad things, I just want to be, this is weird for us, but these are the progressive visionaries. This is what the early progressives wanted. They wanted really powerful executive authority to be able to do big things for America that Americans couldn't do for themselves. Build sewage systems, build transportation systems, build housing, all these things. There was an establishment that did that. And now in the '60s, we progressives are sort of looking back at our own Frankenstein's monster and saying to ourselves, whoa, this is too much. And naturally, the thing that you do in that moment is to say, how do we put guardrails around these monsters? How do we, the story, the book that my book sort of keys off of is The Power Broker, which is this 1,800-page tome by Robert Moses that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974 that everyone has on their shelf, and about a third to a quarter of people have actually read. It's a sort of a nice thing to display on your and it takes up a lot of room on the bookshelf, so you look cool. But the book is basically this story, right? Moses was an old small p progressive, and he becomes very powerful, and then he just does stuff to New York that people are outraged about. He mows down forests. He tears down neighborhoods. He threatened other neighborhoods that were some of the saved by Jane Jacobs. It's a sort of the most iconic is that he builds the Cross Bronx Expressway across the South Bronx, destroyed a bunch of working class neighborhoods, and then by the time that's in the '50s, by the '70s when the book comes out, not coincidentally, weeks after Richard Nixon resigns, the South Bronx is an urban wasteland. And it's so clear to progressives that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that our job now is to put guardrails, to insert points where ordinary people can check these establishment figures. And so that comes in just waves. You just see it. It's interesting, as the research went on for this book, in various realms, in the world of transmission and electrical transmission and housing and public transportation and other infrastructure, everyone has a story like this is the constant narrative, but nobody from very rarely do people in like the transportation space talk to the people in the transmission space, talk to the people in the housing space. They're all dealing with different laws passed in the same moment with the same spirit of, we're not gonna let these motherfuckers do this to us anymore. And so we're gonna create environmental laws that make it so that before you can build a housing project, you have to consult with the community. Before you build a transportation, there's an arcane amendment put in the 1966 Transportation Authorization Bill called the Yarborough Rule, designed to make it so that the Texas Department of Highway Department couldn't build a road from San Antonio to the airport through a park. That becomes a Supreme Court case, and Thurgood Marshall issues a ruling that essentially makes it impossible for any project that includes federal transportation dollars to touch a single blade of grass in a public place, like a golf course. You can't go through a golf course. In the same, over and over, there's housing preservation laws, there's wetlands protection. In all these cases, there is some impulse to empower some bureaucracy, like the Clean Water Act. There are elements where you're going to have the EPA come and do, but in most cases, it's private action, right? It's that there is someone in the community who doesn't want that thing to be done by the establishment, and we as Democrats and progressives are going to create mechanisms where they can stop it. I want to just pause here to say, both the impulse to want to build more electricity for poor people and the impulse not to want some establishment to push people out of their homes because you're reclaiming that land for a highway or for a whatever, these are both impulses that most people in this room will embrace. These are both rational, thoughtful, well-intentioned in most cases, and they're both, if taken to an extreme, terribly corrupt. Like, you don't want a system where one person can do something without consulting any of the people around, and you don't want a system in which anyone can raise any objection, specious though it may be, that would make it so the project can't go, or that they could, even more insidious is that in many cases, people don't even propose good projects because they know that someone is going to raise an objection, and that objection is going to lead to a court case, and there's going to be gazillion dollars in legal costs and delays, and it's like, in the end, it's not going to pencil out, not because the project isn't good, but because the process is too much. And so we've got a housing crisis in this country. We don't have high-speed rail. We've got bridges falling down. We've got places where clearly there's room for growth, and we're not doing it. These are all the children, this is all downstream of the fact that for the last 50 years, our movement has made it almost impossible to do things. And then I'll end this monologue with this, which is, that's why Trump was elected, right? This is, if we as Democrats are the party of government, and government isn't working, people are going to turn to the other side. And certainly a guy that seems to not care about rules at all. So this is sort of the last point that I really want to leave you with, and though I'm happy to talk more. The point I'd like you to come away with is, we are culpable for this mess. If we are not going to do the hard work of helping people imagine how we're going to decide, as you said in the question, between people should have a voice but not a veto, if we're not going to create systems that create that sort of dynamic where ultimately, in relatively expeditious form, government hears all the concerns and then makes a decision and moves forward, you can't be surprised that ordinary voters who expect government to do this will turn to the other side and to a madman who's going to break through this incompetent bureaucracy. Which is not to say that we're at fault entirely and the conservatives are off the hook. It is to say that the sadness is that we have some culpability here, but that's also the opportunity. We could articulate new mechanisms, and this is sort of what, go forth and do this. Like, right, we need you as young leaders and aspiring leaders to be thinking of like, here's a way to balance the Jeffersonian and the Hamiltonian impulse so that when we are thinking about how to do housing the correct way or transportation the correct way or energy the correct way, that you are incorporating these two impulses in a balanced way.
Okay, before we bring up a panel that's going to follow this to talk a little bit in the weeds about how we do that, I am going to put you on the hook you are talking to a bunch of leaders around this country who are responsible for balancing these competing priorities and figuring out what the right mechanism is to make progress. So if you could leave them with one or two pieces of advice on how to do that, what do you tell them?
Yeah, so the first is, my feeling is just to the degree that most progressives don't have in their intellectual toolkits this idea that there are two impulses that you're trying to weigh, right? You enter you enter the conversation about there's a new housing development, and the presumption in many cases is that the progressive position is to be against development. Like that's like they're the developers and they are bad, and the progressives are against development and want to preserve green space or whatever it is. My advice to you is to think, the first advice is to think through the situation. You've got competing priorities. Yes, you want to maintain green space. You want people to have access to parks and to preserve landscape that is in danger. You also have a priority to provide housing. So that's one. Two, and this is going to get me a little hot water because I bet you everyone in this room has already purchased Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance, which is a great book. There is now a growing movement on the other side to say, no, I don't think that there should be any review. The building housing should be an entire ministerial thing. Like this is what YIMBYism is, right? Like if there's a plot of land, you should be able to build, and the owner wants to build whatever it is, a fourplex on a single family plot. There should be nothing stopping them. And I think in many cases that's probably right, but there are others where it's not right, right? And like this is probably the reason that YIMBYism has sort of sped ahead of all other elements of the agenda, on the abundance agenda, to use that phrase, abundance, because it's easy for us as progressives to say power is now among the no's of the neighborhood level, and we can devolve it to the person who owns the plot and wants to build. So that's a sort of an automatic yes. That's a Jeffersonian change. Obviously, there are two things about it. One is it doesn't work for transmission lines. It doesn't work for rail. It doesn't there's no way to devolve power. Like you need some powerful institution to decide where the rail is going to go, where the transmission line is going to go, where the bridge is going to be built, et cetera, et cetera. But two, I don't love progressivism going to a place where people who have legitimate gripes about where housing is going to be built are told that they have no voice, right? That it's just this. What we want is for people to feel. I'm sorry for those of you who like went to college and read John Rawls and didn't understand it then. I still don't understand it, but I'm going to use the veil of ignorance, which many of you may remember. Like the question is, before you know what the housing project is going to be, what the authorities are going to choose, what is a process that would make people feel as if they had voice, but did not give them a veto? What would make it so that if the result of the process was something that they didn't accept or they didn't like, they still would presume that the process was on the up and up? Because right now, the moment you don't get the outcome you want, you sue because you say the process was messed up, or they didn't consider this environmental consideration, or there's always another. It seems like there's always another thing you can do to get the outcome you want. Our goal as progressives should be to give ordinary Americans a sense that there is someone in charge who is going to weigh their private interest at their house or in their little neighborhood against the interests of the country as a whole, and weigh those private and parochial concerns seriously, not just sort of wave them off. So I would say to you, like, that is the system that we need, not one that is Robert Moses ignoring everyone, not one where everyone who has any objection has actually the power to stop it. We need to have some balance, and that's going to change in realm to realm. And that's, but I think that that's a more popular and more palatable platform for progressives to articulate. And I would hope that the folks in this room would be able to see that as a roadmap for the future.
Wonderful. Can you all join me in thanking Marc Dunkleman for his time?